Rain turned the mountain road into a shining artery of moving reflections. Headlights carved tunnels through fog dense as breath, scattering droplets that flashed like sparks. Wind bent the trees outward, their silhouettes writhing in silver light. A black pickup rushed forward, its engine pushing against gravity, wipers slashing the windshield in mechanical rhythm. Inside, the driver fought exhaustion. Caffeine and regret blurred together. He leaned forward, squinting into gray nothing. Then, motion. A shape crossed the beam, massive and alive. Instinct seized muscle, but metal and momentum ignored mercy. Tires screamed, rubber burned, and impact thundered across the forest. For a fraction of a heartbeat, the world fractured. Steel met bone, light met fur. Time stopped breathing. The truck shuddered, fish-tailed, then steadied. Rain returned, washing everything clean, except the echo. Behind the truck, silence thickened until it became a living thing that no one heard. Steam hissed from the dented hood as the truck idled, a wounded creature coughing into night. The driver sat rigid, knuckles white on the steering wheel. His chest rose and fell in staccato bursts that fogged the glass. He opened the door, stepped into the wet dark, and faced the consequence painted in red taillight glow. The bear lay stretched across the asphalt, colossal, still. Rain gathered in her fur, forming rivers that traced the curve of muscle and shoulder before sliding away. One paw reached toward the forest, frozen mid-gesture. The smell was raw earth and iron. The man's throat tightened, breath caught like a stone. He backed away slowly, climbed into the cab, slammed the door. The truck lurched forward, fleeing its own heartbeat. When the engine sound dissolved into distance, only rain remained, and beneath the trees, two small golden eyes reflected what it left behind.
From the thicket's edge, the cub had watched the light devour his world. The forest that had always whispered now groaned under a new sound, metal and thunder, alien and final. He had followed the scent of his mother through the ferns, tiny paws slipping in mud slick with rain. The air carried fear, oil, and something colder. When he reached her, warmth still lingered under the skin. He pressed his nose into her side, expecting movement, breath, a soft growl. Nothing. Rain pooled in her fur, her scent began to fade beneath the chemical sting of rubber and heat. The cub whimpered, a small sound swallowed instantly by fog. Far beyond, wolves answered with low harmony, neither cruel nor kind, simply aware. Overhead, a raven circled once, its wings cutting through the vapor like a signature across sky. The cub lowered his head and waited beside what remained of safety. Morning leaked into the valley through seams of mist. The road shimmered, a pale scar between forests steaming from last night's rain. The cub remained where darkness had left him, motionless, drenched, eyes wide with something older than fear. Each breath painted small ghosts on the cold air. Around him, the world stirred reluctantly. Dripping branches, distant river, the cry of a single jay somewhere unseen. But near the asphalt center, there was only stillness. The scent that had once meant home now hung faint and foreign. He turned his head toward the woods, half expecting the familiar rumble that never came. Instead, a faraway mechanical hum bled through the mist, growing steadily louder. The cub didn't move. He had no word for rescue, no shape for hope, only instinct, a small heartbeat waiting to be recognized. In the reflection of a puddle beside him, the sky opened one cautious eye.
Eli Brandt had patrolled these mountains for years, memorized every curve where fog thickened and deer appeared without sound. Yet that morning the forest felt wrong, like a room disturbed while its owner slept. When his headlights touched the shape ahead, The steering wheel grew heavy in his hands. He stopped, stepped out, and the cold struck through the seams of his coat. Mist drifted low, carrying the scent of wet pine and blood long washed away. The bear's body lay where gravity had left it, immense and oddly peaceful. Beside it sat the cub, fur-matted, gaze unwavering. No snarl, no retreat, only waiting. Eli felt a tremor crawl beneath his ribs, an echo of some failure buried years before. He lowered his flashlight. The beam slid across gold eyes reflecting dawn. In that silent exchange, duty fractured into empathy, and the forest itself seemed to pause for witness. Static filled the ranger's radio, a low electrical storm trapped between frequencies. Eli spoke carefully, words breaking into fragments of rain. Collision, adult down, cub alive. The transmission vanished into static and returned as faint acknowledgement. He exhaled, lowering the device. Around him the mist thickened, curling between trees like smoke from unseen fires. The cub hadn't moved. Drops gathered on its muzzle, trembled, fell. Eli took a slow step forward, then another, boots whispering against gravel. The animal lifted its head, but did not flee. It simply watched, as though measuring something invisible between them. The air carried no sound except breathing, one human, one wild, both uncertain. Above, a raven traced a widening circle, its shadow passing over them like a hand blessing or warning. When Eli finally turned back toward his truck, he realized the forest had not accepted him, only tolerated his trespass for the moment.
By mid-morning, the rescue truck crested the ridge, lights diffused into milk-white fog. Dr. Mara Ellis stepped out first, boots sinking into wet needles, hands steady from repetition, heart unsteady from everything else. Years of wildlife triage had taught her distance, but the sight before her unraveled it instantly. A cub seated beside its fallen mother, not wandering, not hiding, merely present. The rain had polished the world to silence. She crouched, letting the tranquilizer gun hang loosely, eyes tracing the slow rise and fall of the cub's chest. It blinked once, unafraid. Her breath caught, then settled into the rhythm of rain. Behind her, Eli watched without speaking, as if words might fracture the fragile thread holding the scene together. Mara extended a gloved hand toward emptiness, not to claim, only to acknowledge. The cub bowed its head slightly, and the world remembered what gentleness looked like. They worked with ritual precision, movements quiet as prayer. A tarp spread, straps unfolded, tools aligned on damp ground. The mother's body was lifted first, swaddled in canvas, dignity restored by care. Then the cub. Mara wrapped him in a wool blanket, his heartbeat trembling through fabric like faint percussion. Eli secured the carrier, rain dripping from his hat brim. Somewhere deeper in the trees, a wolf's cry threaded the air, part elegy, part hunger. The cub stirred at the sound, but remained still. When the truck door closed, its echo rolled through the valley like closure. As the convoy started down the winding road, the raven launched from a branch and followed, black wings slicing through fog. The forest reclaimed its silence, leaving only impressions in mud where paws and boots had shared the same ground for the briefest intersection of mercy and loss.
Inside the moving truck, everything vibrated. Engine, rain, the soft shudder of the crate against metal floor. The world outside blurred into gray streaks, mountain after mountain, dissolving behind glass. Mara drove with both focus and fatigue, her reflection flickering across the windshield like another ghost inside the cab. Beside her, the carrier remained still, except for the faint rhythm of the cub's breathing. Occasionally, he lifted his head, eyes open but unseeing, ears twitching at sounds too distant to name. Each curve of the road carried them farther from what had been home.
Eli's patrol vehicle followed behind, headlights steady, a silent guardian or witness. Neither ranger nor vet spoke through the radio. Some silences do not tolerate words. Above the storm's edge, the Raven kept pace, its shadow passing intermittently across their windshield like a metronome, counting the distance between guilt and grace. The rehabilitation center appeared as a pale geometry of glass and steel carved into wilderness, a fragile promise of order inside chaos. Floodlights pooled on wet concrete, transforming the arriving truck into silver outline. Inside, warmth met cold air, a hiss of transition. Mara carried the cub through automatic doors, his small body cocooned in damp wool, scent of rain still clinging. The intake room glowed low amber, designed to mimic dawn. She placed him within a padded enclosure lined with straw, soft fabric, and quiet. The hum of thermostats replaced the forest's wind. Eli watched through observation glass, shoulders heavy, eyes hollow. On the monitor, the cub's breathing slowed, evened, found rhythm again. A single droplet slid from his muzzle onto the blanket and vanished like memory into fabric. Outside, mist coiled around the buildings, sealing night away. Inside, survival inhaled its first uncertain breath.
Hours passed without movement. The cub remained in the corner, a small coil of damp fur against synthetic straw. Cameras watched quietly from above, red lights blinking like patient eyes. Inside the observation room, the air smelled of antiseptic and rain carried in on boots. Dr. Mara recorded vitals mechanically, but her gaze stayed on the silent creature beyond the glass. The hum of heaters filled the space with artificial calm. On the monitor, the cub twitched once, startled by his own reflection, then lowered his head again. Stillness took on shape, neither rest nor fear, but something suspended between. Eli leaned against the wall, hearing the faint echo of rain outside. To him, the cub looked less like a survivor and more like an unanswered question. In the sterile glow of the center, nature and guilt breathed the same air, separated only by a pain too clear to hide behind. Night deepened over the rehabilitation center, clouds pressing close to glass roofs like heavy thoughts. Inside, shadows moved with the rhythm of machines. Mara stood alone, reviewing the incident report glowing pale on her screen. Her pen hovered, paused, then fell still. Every word reduced the tragedy to numbers, impact, time, coordinates, but memory refused compression. She turned toward the enclosure again. The cub hadn't shifted position. His small chest rose and fell unevenly, as if memory itself interrupted breath. Across the glass, the reflection of the mother bear's body flickered in Mara's mind, superimposed over the cub's form. Outside, rain began again, steady and hypnotic. Eli walked the outer corridor, flashlight tracing the perimeter, though he already knew nothing threatened them but silence. In the surveillance feed, the cub stirred briefly, paw moving as if reaching for something just beyond the frame, then stilled once more beneath mechanical dawn.
Eli's reflection ghosted across the glass wall as he stared at the cub inside. The flicker of fluorescent light made his own face look foreign, older, unfinished. His memory wandered backward to another call years ago, another creature struck on the highway. Back then, he hadn't stopped. He'd assumed it was too late. The next morning, they'd found the body still warm, eyes open, tracks of struggle carved into dirt. The guilt had faded, but never left, only sleeping beneath duty's surface. Now it returned in the shape of a small heartbeat behind glass. The cub lifted its head once, gaze landing directly on Eli's shadow, and the ranger felt something inside him tilt. He switched off the hallway light, unable to bear the mirror image of himself reflected in those eyes. Somewhere outside, the raven settled on the roof, its claws clicking against metal like an unspoken reminder. Near midnight, the security feed captured a single, almost imperceptible sound, a soft exhale followed by a low whimper. Bruno had shifted for the first time since arrival. His blanket, still smelling faintly of pine and rain, rustled as he curled deeper into its folds. Mara, reviewing footage in the monitoring room, froze the frame instinctively. The cub's eyes were closed, but his breathing had changed. Grief had rhythm now, no longer chaos. She leaned back, watching the slow expansion of his ribs on the screen, a fragile metronome keeping time against emptiness. Across the facility, Eli checked doors, unaware that something fragile had just re-entered the world. The hum of the generators, the whisper of ventilation, the faint drip from an unseen pipe, all merged into a single living pulse. In the sterile, man-made womb of light, the forest began to breathe again, quietly, through one small survivor's sleep.
Dawn came without color, a pale wash through thin clouds. The forest outside the center glistened, every leaf trembling beneath new dew. Inside, Mara moved through corridors still wrapped in night's silence. She paused at the cub's enclosure, notebook pressed to her chest. Bruno was awake, his head lifted, gaze fixed on a point beyond glass. She followed it and realized he was watching light shift across the floor, as though he recognized its warmth. His body looked steadier, his eyes clearer. Mara switched the intercom to low, letting her voice carry through a hum of static, a soft rhythm of reassurance. The cub blinked slowly, ears flicking toward the sound, not in fear, but recognition. He turned toward the bowl placed beside him, sniffed, and began to eat. Each movement deliberate, each swallow a declaration of life reclaimed. Outside, the first raven cry sliced through the valley like resurrection. Beyond the glass and comfort of machines, wilderness continued its indifferent symphony. Wolves moved through distant valleys, their calls threading across dawn like veins of sound. Bruno's ears twitched at the faint echoes, instinct stirring beneath sedation of safety. He paced once, short steps, unsteady but deliberate. On the monitors, Mara watched the shift, noting every movement as data, though her heart recognized it as memory. Outside, Eli traced the perimeter trail, boots crushing frost. He too heard the faint, mournful chords of the wild carried through morning air. It reminded him of the sound before impact, the living pulse he'd shattered by accident or fate. Inside the enclosure, the cub stopped pacing, turned toward the window, and exhaled a long, tremulous sigh. Somewhere beyond, the wolves answered, not calling him home, but reminding him that wildness never forgets its own, even when surrounded by walls.
A week passed. The enclosure changed a little, yet its air thickened with unspoken things: routine, scent, faint warmth of survival. The staff avoided speaking loudly near Bruno, moving in practiced silence as though in the presence of mourning. Mara decided to attempt what she called environmental recall. She brought branches collected from the crash site, pine stripped with rain, bark splintered, faint scent of sap and soil. She placed them in a corner, arranging them like fragments of memory. The cub approached slowly, nose twitching. When he brushed against the pine, he froze, then curled into it, resting his head upon the needles. Cameras caught his muscles soften, breath deepen. Mara stood behind the glass, feeling her throat tighten. Science recorded relaxation response, but she knew it was grief finding form. Outside, the raven landed near the loading dock, tilting its head as though acknowledging the quiet ritual within. That night, the air thickened again. Storm fronts rolled across the valley, thunder vibrating through glass panels. Rain lashed the center, drumming an uneven rhythm against walls built for calm. Inside, Bruno's breathing quickened. Lightning fractured the sky, and for a second, the world flashed white, metallic, merciless.
A clap of thunder followed, echoing the sound of the crash that had ended his old life. Panic detonated inside him. He lunged toward the glass, claws scraping against the floor, a cry bursting from his chest, not rage, but memory. Alarms triggered, lights shifted to emergency amber. Mara ran through the corridor, heart pounding, reaching the enclosure as the cub pressed himself into a corner trembling. She didn't enter, only sat outside, back against glass, breathing in sync with his panic. Minute by minute, breath by breath, sound returned to silence. The storm moved east. Inside, both heartbeat and fear began to slow.
When dawn returned, it found the center washed clean. Rainwater dripped from gutters, pooling on the asphalt like mirrors to a gentler sky. Inside, Mara remained where she had fallen asleep, back to the glass, head resting on folded arms. The cub lay on the other side, motionless but calm, separated by transparency and trust. Eli found them that way during morning rounds. He didn't disturb the stillness. He only noted the balance, the strange symmetry of two beings healing without touch. As he moved down the corridor, the radio whispered faint static, carrying weather updates, wind reports, and something else. His own reflection in sound, the noise of guilt fading. In the enclosure, Bruno lifted his head and yawned, the small gesture monumental in its ordinariness. Outside, mist unraveled from the trees, revealing sunlight across drenched needles. The storm was over, but its echo lingered in every breath. Far below the center, the road where it had all begun gleamed under morning light. Puddles caught the sun, turning asphalt into fragments of glass. Tire marks had faded beneath new rain, yet the ghosts of movement remained. A pickup truck, freshly washed but never clean, slowed as it passed the curve. Carter Hale gripped the steering wheel tighter, eyes locked on the place memory refused to bury. He didn't stop this time either, but the silence that followed him felt heavier than before. Back at the center, Bruno sniffed the air suddenly, as if catching scent of distance. Across the valley, the raven rose again, wings slicing through sunlight. Everything in motion, guilt, healing, wind, spiraled back toward that ribbon of road. It waited, patient and unforgiving, for the moment the wild would return to claim what civilization had borrowed only long enough to understand remorse.
Days folded into one another, indistinguishable in the quiet pulse of routine. The cub's enclosure smelled faintly of pine and warmed straw. Morning light slid down the glass wall, painting slow-moving stripes across his fur. He had begun to eat on his own, cautiously, as if each swallow tested memory's permission. Mara kept the lights low, mimicking the canopy of forest shade. She wrote her notes, but watched him more than she wrote, her pen drifting mid-sentence. Bruno no longer trembled. He simply existed, body present, spirit elsewhere. The staff spoke softly, moving like ghosts, respecting the strange sanctity that hung between life and morning. Outside, fog burned away in fragments, revealing a river running fuller from recent storms. On its banks, a raven stood ankle-deep, drinking. Everything seemed alive again, though not yet awake. Healing, Mara thought, was just another word for remembering without breaking. At night, when the center's hum dimmed to mechanical sleep, Bruno often rose and moved toward the window. He pressed his nose to the glass, leaving faint circles of breath that evaporated instantly. Beyond the reflection, nothing moved but his own shape, small, uncertain, glowing in muted light. Sometimes his paw traced the line of that reflection, as though he expected it to move. The camera caught these gestures in silence, time-stamped and clinical, but they carried an ache that no chart could explain. Mara watched from the control room, hand resting over the pause button, afraid of interrupting something sacred. Through the screen, she felt the echo of his search. Perhaps he wasn't looking for his mother, she thought. Perhaps he was looking for the part of himself that had gone with her. In every animal she'd ever saved,
She'd never seen one so still in longing.
Eli walked the outer perimeter trail before dawn, flashlight beams swaying between trees. The road's curve where it all began lay below him, a thin scar cutting through mist. He stopped, hands buried in pockets, the cold, biting skin that no longer felt deserving of warmth. He had filed his report, told the facts, but nowhere had he written what mattered, that he'd seen himself in that cub's silence. Back at the center, he lingered outside Bruno's enclosure, gaze drawn to the small form sleeping in curled shadow. His own reflection hovered beside it, distorted, uncertain. For a brief moment, the cub stirred and looked up, eyes meeting his through layers of glass and gilt. Eli stepped back, heart stuttering. He realized then that redemption wasn't forgiveness, it was endurance, the choice to keep showing up even when the past refused to vanish. The raven on the roof shifted its wings, listening. Mara had begun sleeping on a cot near the observation room, her dreams woven with images of forest and heartbeat. The hum of heaters became her lullaby, the steady rhythm of Bruno's breath, her reassurance. She had memorized every sound, footstep, sigh, the soft rustle of straw when he turned in sleep. Yet she also knew silence too well. It frightened her more than any cry. One night she left the lights dim and read her notes aloud softly, her words blending with machine hum. Bruno's ears twitched as if following a melody. He didn't lift his head, but something in his stillness changed. In that moment, Mara understood that comfort wasn't given, it was earned, breath by breath. The raven outside perched near the security lamp, feathers shining like wet coal. Its gaze met hers through reflection, and for a second, she wondered who was truly studying whom.
The day began brighter than most, but light carried strange edges. In the corner of Bruno's enclosure, a branch of pine needles, once green, had dried to gray. Mara replaced it carefully, noting how scent had faded, how memory aged even faster than wood. The cub sniffed the new branch, then rested against it, half asleep. Lewis Ward arrived that afternoon, clipboard in hand, his presence grounding. He observed the cub quietly, nodding once. Resilience, he wrote in his report, though the word meant little without context. Outside, clouds gathered again, dark and thin as scars. Inside, the lights dimmed automatically to mimic approaching dusk. Bruno's breathing steadied, matching the rhythm of the forest's pulse beyond walls. In that delicate stillness, the line between confinement and protection blurred. Healing always carried a shadow, Mara thought, and some wounds grew best in quiet darkness where no one interfered. That evening, just before the sun dissolved behind the ridgeline, the valley filled with sound. From somewhere distant came the echoing chorus of wolves. Their voices threaded across the wind, sharp and mournful, vibrating against the windows like invisible hands knocking on glass. Bruno lifted his head, nostrils flaring, pupils wide. Instinct flickered awake, the old rhythm of fear and belonging intertwined. He stood, shaky but determined, pacing the enclosure's edge. The sound pressed deeper, primal memory calling from far beyond metal walls. In the observation room, Mara felt it too, something ancient shifting beneath reason. She muted the speakers but couldn't mute her own heartbeat. The cub finally stopped pacing, turned toward the forest beyond the building, and exhaled a long, low breath that misted the window. Outside, the raven soared into twilight, following the direction of the call. The forest had remembered him, and he had heard its answer.
Morning broke sharp and clear after the night of howls. The air smelled clean, rinsed by unseen rain. Bruno moved differently now, slower but more deliberate, as if weighing invisible choices. His reflection trailed him on the glass, duplicating every tilt of his head. Mara stood in the doorway of the monitoring room, exhaustion softened by quiet pride.
The cub's strength was returning, yet something else shimmered beneath it, a restless awareness. He was beginning to remember that walls were not part of the world. Outside, Eli checked equipment near the holding pens, noting claw marks on a section of wood paneling. Not aggression, he wrote. Instinct rehearsal. The phrase lingered with him, uncomfortable and true. Inside, Bruno pressed his nose once more to the glass and stared at his reflection. For a second, the outline shifted. He saw not himself, but the endless dark of trees waiting beyond. Eli drove out before sunset, following the winding road toward the crash site. The forest had reclaimed most of the evidence. Grass sprouted through asphalt cracks, moss creeping over forgotten tire marks. He parked near the bend, stepped out, and stood where the impact had split one life into two paths. The air smelled faintly of sap and rust. Kneeling, he brushed leaves aside and uncovered fragments of the broken headlights still embedded in soil. He turned one shard over in his hand, the light catching a faint smear of old paint. Memory hit like thunder, but quieter this time. The raven landed on a branch above him, silent witness to repentance. Eli buried the fragment under moss, a private ritual of surrender. When he rose, the forest had already begun absorbing the gesture, indifferent yet accepting. Far below, in the center's warmth, the cub slept without stirring.
That night, Mara walked the perimeter hallway with slow, measured steps. The storm had not returned, but its pressure still lingered in the air. Through the glass, she watched Bruno move among the branches and straw, pausing to lift his face toward the vents that carried faint traces of pine. His world had shrunk, yet he made it vast through memory. Mara thought of all the creatures she'd healed, the ones who fought, the ones who surrendered, none like this. Compassion, she realized, was not gentleness, it was endurance, a willingness to stand close to another's pain without flinching. Her reflection wavered in the window beside his. For an instant, they seemed the same species, divided by circumstance, not form. Outside, Eli's flashlight crossed the courtyard like a wandering star, brief and human. Above them both, the raven roosted under the gutter, feathers rattling softly against the settling wind. Weeks began to stretch wider, marked by small victories that only careful eyes noticed. Bruno's coat thickened, his movements gained rhythm, his appetite steady. He explored every corner of the enclosure, nosing rocks, splashing at the shallow stream built for him. Cameras recorded each motion, sterile witnesses to the rebirth of instinct. In staff meetings, Mara's tone grew lighter. Eli even managed a rare smile that didn't look borrowed. Yet underneath progress lay hesitation, the inevitable knowledge that healing carried an ending. Every ounce of strength the cub gained brought him closer to departure. Outside, the first frost crept into the valley, etching white lace over pine tips. Nature was rehearsing its cycle of letting go. Inside, the heartbeat monitors pulsed steady green, counting moments toward that same inevitability. Even the raven seemed quieter now, as if conserving breath for the long flight soon to come.
Early light poured through the ceiling vents, carrying the faint musk of rain-soaked pine. A new scent drifted into the enclosure, wild and raw, unlike the sterile air he'd grown used to. Bruno lifted his head sharply, nostrils flaring, pupils widening. His paws pressed against the glass as if scent alone could pull him through. In the corridor, Mara paused, watching through the reflection. She had requested the introduction of natural pheromones to test his instinct response. It worked too well. The cub began pacing, low growls reverberating softly from his chest. Not in anger, but longing. She made notes, but her pen trembled. The wild was no longer a distant memory. It was a living pulse reclaiming its rhythm inside him. Outside the facility, wind rustled the treetops, carrying whispers of rivers and unseen tracks. The boundary between safety and freedom had just thinned to something transparent as breath. Eli spent the morning in the observation deck, tracking wildlife reports across Glacier's northern border. Bears were returning early this season, unusual, restless. Each dot on his digital map pulsed like a heartbeat. When his eyes drifted to Bruno's feed, he felt the same pulse mirrored there, contained but undeniable. The cub was ready for something the humans weren't. Mara joined him briefly, her silence saying what neither could. The time to decide was approaching. He closed the laptop softly, as though ending a prayer. Through the glass wall below, the cub climbed over logs, pawing at the scent-enriched branches with fierce curiosity. Eli remembered the moment of collision, the chaos, the sound, and realized redemption was not about undoing, but returning what had been taken. He left the control room, stepping into the sunlight that waited like judgment, knowing the hardest mercy would soon be the act of letting go.
They began with a simple simulation. The outer compound gates opened to reveal a transitional pen, half wild, half contained. Soil, water, stones, everything arranged to mimic the forest's unpredictability. Bruno hesitated at first, then crossed the threshold with cautious strength. His paws met earth, and the change was immediate. Shoulders lifted, movements slower, deliberate. He sniffed bark, tasted wind, marked territory with silent confidence. Mara observed through reinforced glass, breath shallow. Every instinct reignited before her eyes, ancient memory unfolding through muscle and scent. Eli recorded notes beside her, his voice low, reverent. Bruno climbed the artificial ridge, paused at the top, and looked outward beyond the enclosure wall toward the real forest shimmering beyond chain-link boundaries. For a heartbeat, the illusion failed. Steel could not contain longing. He turned his head slightly, catching Mara's reflection. The cub's gaze carried no fear now, only recognition of what waited beyond comfort. Wind rose that evening, threading through vents and hollow beams, echoing faintly down corridors. In the compound yard, Bruno stood still, head raised, listening. Somewhere far away, a river carried the scent of salmon upstream, impossible, yet undeniable. He leaned into the current of air, muscles tightening as if memory had muscle too. Inside, lights dimmed automatically, sensors marking night. Mara watched the monitor, hypnotized by the quiet grace of instinct reclaiming motion. Eli entered quietly, coffee cooling in his hand. Neither spoke. Language was irrelevant here. On screen, Bruno turned once in slow circles before lying down facing the dark line of forest visible beyond fences. The wind hummed low through metal. It wasn't music, but something older. Every structure, every wire seemed to vibrate in unison, as though the building itself remembered the wilderness it had tried to keep outside and was preparing to return it.
The next morning, the valley was thick with fog, dense, white, and heavy as wool. The team used it as cover to open the secondary gate, extending Bruno's range into the outer compound. He explored cautiously at first, then with growing confidence, his breath visible in the cold. Mara followed his progress via drone feed, her heart tracking every motion. When he stopped near the sound wall, something shifted in the mist. A shadow moved, his own reflection cast back through fog, magnified, almost towering. For a long moment, Bruno faced it head-on, unmoving. Then he lowered his head, not in fear but recognition. The forest was talking in shapes now. Back at the control station, Eli adjusted audio gain. Faint echoes rolled through speakers, leaves rustling, faint river song, distant thunder. All natural, yet strangely synchronized. Nature wasn't testing Bruno, it was waiting. The fog began to lift, revealing direction. When the gates closed again that evening, the cub resisted returning indoors. His paws dug into damp soil,
claws dark with mud. Mara knelt a few feet away, careful not to cross the invisible threshold of trust. She didn't speak, only mirrored stillness. Slowly, Bruno's breathing steadied. He lowered his muzzle and pressed it against the earth, exhaling a low sound that trembled through the ground. It was as if he was thanking it or asking permission. The sensors caught the vibration, translating it as interference across monitors. Eli stood behind her, watching silently, aware that science had no vocabulary for this. The cub finally turned back toward the enclosure, stepping over the line without command. When the gate sealed behind him, the earth outside seemed to hum once, then settle. Mara touched the ground where he'd stood. It was still warm. Life, she thought, never truly leaves, only waits.
Night returned with restless calm. The facility's exterior lights cast long stripes of gold across the courtyard. Bruno stood just inside his enclosure, eyes fixed on the viewing glass. Mara sat on the floor outside, legs crossed, exhaustion softened by quiet awe. For the first time, he approached deliberately, closing the space between them. Their reflections met before their eyes did. She felt the cold radiating from the glass, but imagined warmth passing through. He lifted a paw, placed it against the surface. She mirrored it instinctively. Two living heartbeats separated by invention. In that moment, predator and protector became simply survivors. The cameras recorded the gesture without understanding, but the data mattered less than the silence that followed. Behind them, Eli watched, not intruding, only bearing witness. Compassion, he thought, was proximity without possession. When the lights dimmed, Bruno remained by the glass, as if guarding her sleep from inside. By the end of the second month, the wild called daily. Bruno's appetite surged, his muscles firmed, and his eyes had taken on a depth that no longer belonged to captivity. Mara sighed before Eli admitted it, the readiness. Release forms were signed quietly, signatures drawn like slow breaths. Lewis approved the schedule, choosing the same valley from which he had been taken. Preparations felt more like farewells disguised as procedure. Crate, transport straps, tranquilizer just in case. Rituals of controlled freedom. That evening, the Raven returned to the roof, silent observer of final days. Bruno paced less, as though aware the waiting was almost done. He no longer looked for the glass or responded to voices. He was listening to something deeper, the pulse of distance. Mara recorded her last entry with a trembling hand. Healing complete, she wrote, but her chest felt hollow. Endings rarely sound like victory. They sound like wind.
The sky held no stars that night, only the blurred reflection of moonlight smothered by thin clouds. Inside, the center was half dark, lights dimmed to amber. Bruno slept curled against the far wall, body rising and falling in steady rhythm. Mara watched through the glass one final time, palms pressed to the cold. Every part of her training told her this was success, yet it felt like surrender. Eli walked the corridor, stopping beside her. Neither spoke. Beyond them, snow had begun to fall, slow, weightless, soundless. Each flake that touched the glass melted instantly, leaving streaks that looked like tears. Somewhere deep within the valley, the wolves called again. Softer now, patient. The forest was waiting with open silence. Inside, one life prepared to return to it. Time itself seemed to pause, holding its breath before the moment of release that would break two hearts gently. Dawn rose pale and slow. Frost glazed the transport truck, each crystal catching light like broken glass. Bruno entered the crate willingly, a quiet acceptance that stunned everyone. No sedation, no resistance, just the natural grace of one who already knew the way. Mara knelt before the open door, eyes locked on his. She didn't reach out. Some goodbyes require no touch.
Eli fastened the latches, his hands steady but heart unsteady. The truck's engine rumbled, echoing against the mountains like distant thunder remembering itself. As they drove through the forest, sunlight spilled through the trees in shifting gold. Every turn of the road retraced old pain, now transformed. At the release site, mist hung low over ferns. When the gate opened, Bruno stepped forward into silence. One paw, then another, until only footprints remained. The forest accepted him without ceremony. Freedom arrived, not with roar, but with breath.
For several long moments, no one moved. The forest absorbed the sound of the opening crate, swallowed the hum of engines, and replaced it with wind. Bruno paused at the threshold, nostrils flaring, tasting the old air. Damp moss, cold stone, wild memory. Then, with quiet certainty, he crossed from human care into nature's indifference. His fur brushed past fern leaves that folded back instantly, reclaiming him. Mara stood still, fingers trembling at her sides. Eli lowered his eyes, knowing their part in his story had ended exactly where it should. The raven circled overhead once, its shadow gliding across the clearing like a benediction. Bruno disappeared among trees, his form dissolving into gold mist. The team waited until the sounds of his movement faded completely. What remained was only the faint indentation of paws in wet soil, proof of life moving forward, unobserved, uncontained, finally belonging again to itself. The open crate sat abandoned at the edge of the clearing, straw still warm where his weight had been. No one spoke. Mara stepped forward first, touching the rim as though testing the absence it now held. The air around it felt charged, vibrating faintly, as if the forest was whispering gratitude too subtle to name. Eli closed the latch gently, out of habit more than necessity. Lewis marked coordinates, his handwriting deliberate, steady, unwilling to admit sentiment. When they finally turned back toward the truck, the sun had risen high enough to burn the mist away. The road shimmered ahead, bright and cruel in its indifference. Behind them, leaves rustled once and settled. Bruno was already gone. No dramatic farewell, no backward glance. Freedom was wordless. The team drove away slowly, each heartbeat heavier than the tires rolling over gravel. Some rescues, and not in triumph, but in quiet ache.
Within hours, the valley swallowed every trace of human presence. The scent of diesel faded, tire tracks blurred beneath rainfall. Bruno moved through ferns with the grace of inheritance, instinct guiding each step. The canopy closed above him, filtering sunlight into fractured green. Every sound became scripture, branches snapping, rivers speaking in silver tongues, wind stitching through pine needles. He found a shallow stream, sniffed at it, and drank deeply. Water cold enough to sting, real enough to remind him he was home. The forest watched, but did not welcome. Survival here was earned, not given. He walked until the scent of humans thinned into nothing, leaving only the honest perfume of decay and life. When night approached, he curled beneath a fallen cedar, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. Above, the raven perched silently, feathers glossy under starlight, watching the return of something older than mercy. Days later, Eli found himself driving alone back through the mountain road where it had all begun. The turnoff near the crash side still bore the faint curve of old damage, rubber, oil, memory. He parked by instinct, stepping out into the cold silence. The road felt smaller now, humbled by time. He crouched, running his fingers along the scarred asphalt. Moss had begun to grow in the cracks, soft and green. Life reclaiming what loss had burned. He stood there for a long while, unsure whether he was mourning or forgiving. A shadow crossed the road, the raven again. unhurried, deliberate. Eli followed its flight until it vanished toward the deeper forest. He smiled faintly, the gesture more surrender than joy. Somewhere out there, a heartbeat he'd once broken was now beating without him. Sometimes atonement isn't spoken. It's heard in the silence that remains when guilt finally listens.
Back at the rehabilitation center, paperwork replaced presence. Reports filed, case numbers archived, signatures marking closure. But Mara couldn't file the feeling away. She lingered over the release documentation, fingers tracing her own handwriting where she'd noted subject calm, responsive, unrestrained. Words too thin for what the moment had held. Later that evening, she drafted a letter to the Wildlife Board. Request ongoing monitoring of reintroduction zone. Behavioral indicators suggest adaptive success. Clinical tone, heart hidden between lines. When she sealed the envelope, a small brown pine needle slipped from her sleeve, left over from the field. She held it between her fingers, uncertain whether to keep or discard it. Finally, she set it on the windowsill beside the glowing desk lamp. The faint scent of forest lingered in the sterile air, a reminder that not all things need containment to endure. Some simply belong to memory's soil. 3 weeks after release, motion sensors in the Northern Valley triggered twice before dawn. The ranger station's monitor flickered, displaying grainy footage, trees shifting, fog moving, then a shape emerging from shadow. Broad shoulders, thickening coat, steady gait. Bruno. He approached the camera slowly, curiosity guiding him, not fear. For a moment he paused, nose close to the lens, exhaling warm mist that blurred the image. Then he turned away, leaving only the faint echo of his steps. Mara received the footage on her tablet later that morning. She watched it 3 times, then once more without sound. His growth startled her, wilder, fuller, unrecognizable yet unmistakable. She leaned back in her chair, smiling through the ache of pride. Somewhere out there, he was thriving, unobserved except by the quiet patience of trees. The footage ended, screen fading to black. She left it that way, letting silence have the final frame.
Within days, the footage spread quietly through internal channels, biologists, rangers, field staff. Each replay carried the same reverent hush. In a world that measured success by survival, this was rare confirmation. But for Mara, it was more than data. It was proof that something she'd loved without ownership had chosen life freely. Eli called from the field office, his voice quieter than usual. He'd seen the footage too, though neither spoke of emotion. They both knew science demanded restraint. Yet when the call ended, Eli lingered by the window, watching storm clouds gather over the ridge. Rain again. The same rain that had once carried tragedy now returned as renewal. Every droplet felt like punctuation at the end of a long sentence. He closed his eyes, imagining the cub grown strong, walking somewhere beyond reach, his story still unfolding. Freedom, he thought, was just continuity without witnesses. Snow came early that year, veiling the northern forest in silence. Ranger patrols reduced to half routes, the world slowed. In one of the farthest zones, fresh tracks appeared, broad, deep, steady. They led from riverbank to thicket, then vanished beneath drifts. Eli crouched near them, tracing one print with gloved fingers. The shape, the spacing, it could only be him. Bruno's gait had lengthened, stride stronger, direction unwavering. The forest had accepted him, and he, in turn, had accepted its cruelty and grace. Eli smiled, breath clouding the air. He took a single photo, not for reports but for himself, a reminder that redemption sometimes walked on 4 legs. When wind swept across the clearing, the prints filled slowly, erased by nature's constant rewriting. The ranger arose, heart lighter. The bear didn't need to be seen anymore. Proof of life was enough. The rest belonged to the wild alone.
At dusk, the valley transformed into a cathedral of light. Snow glowed gold under the sinking sun. Rivers whispered through ice. Mara stood outside the center, coat pulled tight, watching vapor rise from her breath. Months had passed, yet Bruno's presence lingered in everything. The faint scratch on the glass, the indentation in straw long replaced. She often wondered if healing was reciprocal, if, in saving him, parts of herself had also been mended. From across the field, Eli approached, his boots crunching softly on frost. They didn't speak. There was no need. The sky turned lavender, and somewhere far away a raven's cry split the horizon. It sounded like both farewell and continuation. Mara closed her eyes and whispered a silent thank you to the darkening line of trees. The wild didn't return affection, it offered continuity. And that, she realized, was its truest form of grace. Winter deepened. The forest entered its long sleep, but the story remained awake inside those who had witnessed it. In her office, Mara kept one photograph, the still frame of Bruno standing before the camera lens, half hidden by fog. She never showed it publicly. It belonged to something sacred between silence and survival. Each time she looked at it, she felt the forest breathe through glass, slow and eternal. Eli transferred to a quieter post near the valley, patrolling less, listening more. Some nights he swore he heard distant movement beyond the ridge, a heavy step, a branch snapping, then stillness. Whether real or imagined, he didn't question it. Some stories didn't end, they just changed form. In the cold heart of winter, both man and bear existed under the same endless sky, unseen to one another, but bound by the same pulse that the wilderness never forgets.
Spring came slow, seeping through the frozen ground like memory returning to flesh. The forest stirred, cracking ice and waking rivers. Beneath a slope thick with moss, Bruno emerged from his winter den. His coat glistened with melted frost, muscles heavier, eyes deeper. He sniffed the wind, reading its invisible stories, the scent of salmon upstream, the faint echo of wolves in distance, the steady promise of rain. Every breath drew him closer to rhythm, not memory. The past existed only in instinct now, woven into survival. Above, the raven circled once, letting sunlight ripple across its wings. The valley hummed again, each sound a note in nature's slow awakening. Far below, the remnants of tire tracks had long vanished under roots and grass. There was no trace of man, no boundary of walls, only motion. The bear lifted his head and walked toward the river, silent and infinite. The river had changed, swollen with meltwater and time. Bruno waded carefully through its shallows, claws breaking the surface into silver ribbons. Each ripple carried fragments of the sky above, clouds, sun, fleeting reflection of his own face. He watched the current without recognition. The cub that once trembled in cages no longer lived here. His steps were heavier, deliberate, marked by quiet certainty. On the far bank, a deer herd stood poised, eyes wide yet calm. They recognized strength, not threat. When Bruno turned away, they did not run. The raven landed nearby, picking at stones, indifferent but present. Wind carried the smell of new grass and thawed soil. The world was rebuilding itself molecule by molecule. For the first time, Bruno roared, not anger or hunger, but affirmation. The sound rolled through the valley, low and endless, echoing through trees that had waited all winter to answer.
From the opposite ridge, Eli stood watching through binoculars, breath caught halfway between disbelief and reverence. He had returned unofficially, a volunteer now, stripped of title but richer in purpose. The bear was alive, thriving, each motion fluid, self-assured. Eli lowered the glass slowly, unwilling to break the fragile thread between sight and spirit. Behind him, the wind moved through tall grass, whispering without words. He remembered his first glimpse of Bruno, small, trembling, drenched in fear, and now this giant moving through sunlight as though born from it. Redemption, Eli realized, wasn't an act but a witnessing. He turned away before the bear did, unwilling to disturb perfection with presence. The raven glided past him, silent, its shadow brushing his face like acknowledgement. He smiled faintly. There was peace in invisibility. In that brief moment, both man and bear existed together again, unaware, aligned, and forgiven by the same sky. The wolves came with dusk, their cries threading through birch and fir like old hymns. Bruno lifted his head, ears twitching toward the sound. They were not the same pack as before, yet the cadence was familiar, call and response, life and caution intertwined. He didn't retreat this time. He moved closer to the echo, senses sharp but calm. The forest had shifted, so had he. When the first pair appeared on the ridge, moonlight glancing off their coats, the bear held his ground. The wolves paused, watching, measuring. Then, without challenge or fear, they moved on. Balance restored. The raven flew overhead once, its cry folding into their chorus. For the first time, no hierarchy existed, only coexistence. In that fragile truce of sound and stillness, nature declared equilibrium. The night carried on, unbothered by history. Every creature knew its place again, and none needed to speak it aloud.
Morning sunlight fractured over the river's skin, each glint revealing fragments of stories left behind. Bruno stepped into the water again, unhurried. His reflection shimmered, rippling with current and time. The cub's smaller face no longer appeared. Only the bear remained, fully formed, entirely wild. He drank deeply, the cold water grounding him to the earth. Behind him, deer moved cautiously, their silhouettes mirroring his in the current. Far above, a hawk, perhaps the same raven, circled in slow descent, feathers flashing white in light. The forest had no memory of cages, only motion. Somewhere beyond the ridge, snow still melted, feeding rivers, feeding life. Bruno raised his head, droplets clinging to his fur like stars. For the first time, he was both past and present, origin and continuation. The forest accepted him not as a guest, but as one of its own, an echo now restored to sound. In his cabin near the southern ridge, Eli sat at his wooden desk, pen trembling above paper. Outside, rain tapped the roof gently, a softer version of that night long ago. He wrote slowly, the ink bleeding slightly into the fibers. "To whomever reads this," it began, "there are moments when we are asked to return what was never ours to keep." He described Bruno's release, the valley, the snow, the sound of freedom too pure for language. Then he wrote about silence, the silence of redemption, heavier than confession, lighter than memory. When he finished, he didn't sign his name. He folded the letter and placed it between field logs, leaving it for no one and everyone. Outside, the storm eased. The forest beyond his window swayed gently, each tree bowing as if listening. He closed his eyes. Somewhere, a bear was walking under the same rain. That was enough. Seasons turned again, and the raven became a myth of its own. It followed storms, rivers, migrations, always near where memory lingered. People said its feathers shimmered with light from every place it had flown. Cities, glaciers, dens, graves. One morning, Mara spotted it from her window, perched on the railing outside the lab. Its eyes reflected both sky and shadow. She opened the window slightly. Wind entered, carrying the scent of soil and pine. For a fleeting second, she thought she heard the faint rumble of a distant roar, then only wind again. The raven took flight, feathers slicing air, leaving one small black plume behind on the sill. Mara placed it between pages of her field journal without a word. Later, when she closed the book, it sounded like a heartbeat. The wild had sent a messenger, not of return, but of remembrance, unbroken by distance or time. Years passed quietly. Trees thickened, rivers redrew their courses, and the scars of men vanished under layers of moss and bloom. The rehabilitation center aged too, its metal frames rusting into the color of bark. Vines climbed its walls like forgiveness reclaiming concrete. In archived footage, Bruno appeared older, heavier, unbothered. The recordings ended long before his story did. Visitors to the valley sometimes glimpsed a massive grizzly moving through fog at dawn, always alone, always silent. Legends grew. Some called him guardian, others ghost. But the forest knew truth. He was neither miracle nor myth. He was continuity, unedited. Every paw print he left pressed deeper into soil where human tracks had faded. At night, when wind moved through pines, it carried faint sounds of water, wings, and heartbeat. The wilderness had kept its promise, to remember without judgment, to endure without witness, to live without end. One twilight, years later, Eli walked once more to the edge of that same road where fate had broken and begun. The air was cool, thick with evening mist. He stood in silence, listening. The world was older now, gentler perhaps, or maybe he had changed. Across the valley, a faint rustle, a large shape moving through undergrowth. He couldn't see it, but the sound carried certainty. The bear was still alive. He smiled, eyes stinging against the wind. "You made it," he whispered to no one. He stepped off the pavement, boots sinking into the soft earth that had once held blood and regret. Grass brushed his knees. Life had replaced loss completely. Somewhere above, the raven's cry broke through dusk one last time, low and resonant. Eli tilted his head, acknowledging it. When he turned back toward the road, darkness closed gently behind him, erasing footprints. The forest at night was a living cathedral, branches arching, air thick with hymn. Moonlight touched the river like memory touching skin. Bruno moved through shadows, no longer young, no longer hunted by ghosts. His breath rose in small clouds that dissolved instantly into mist. He paused at the water's edge, lifted his head toward the stars. Somewhere far off, a single wolf answered, not as threat, but kinship. Above, the raven soared, black wings merging with night. The world exhaled, balanced, wordless. In that symmetry, everything found closure. The crash, the rescue, the silence, the waiting. Each thread returned to stillness. The bear stepped into the river once more, and the current folded around him like forgiveness. As he vanished into silver darkness, the forest kept breathing, eternal and undisturbed. Some endings aren't endings at all. They're continuations written in a language only the wild remembers.